Section 106 does not mandate preservation, only the consideration of the effects an undertaking may have on historic resources. The decisions need to balance all considerations, including building and maintaining our infrastructure, and the environmental, historical, and social impacts. The National Historic Preservation Act does not prevent any activities. It only requires that all impacts are taken into account when planning a project. The process should encourage creativity and a common-sense approach to problem solving. With proper planning, the Section 106 process is easy to follow and does not involve great expense. The decision-making process and public involvement should all be documented to demonstrate the National Historic Preservation Act was followed. Once a project is considered a Section 106 undertaking, the project needs to be evaluated for potential impact to historic properties. This sounds very simple, but this step is very often misunderstood. You must look at the type of project first. Is this the type of project that could potentially impact a building or structure if one were located in the area? Even when a structure is not present, there is often confusion when we assume that Section 106 does not apply because there is nothing that we know of within the area. Projects that need further evaluation even when a building or structure is not present in the area include when new right-of-way will be required, when previously undisturbed MoDOT right-of-way will be disturbed, when a bridge will be removed or its superstructure replaced, when the area setting will change significantly, when there is a purchase and sale of a property. Although purchasing property is not an impact, almost anything that is done with that property after purchase, including construction, demolition, and sale, is an impact. If a property is purchased without Section 106 review, and a subsequent Section 106 review before construction reveals a historic building or site, then that project would not receive any federal funds for that property purchase and might not be able to use that property for the intended project. Federal regulations consider the sale of a property to be in effect. For example, selling excess right-of-way to a developer to build a gas station could be an adverse effect if that property contains an archaeological site. You must anticipate, to a certain extent, what the use of the property will be. Projects that are unlikely to have an effect on historic properties are covered under a programmatic agreement for minor highway projects. This means the projects are reported to the SHPO annually but are not given further Section 106 consideration unless circumstances change so that they no longer qualify as a minor project. Examples of minor projects include resurfacing, striping, guardrails, signage, bridge deck repairs, Intelligent Transportation System or ITS improvements. The most effective way to avoid or minimize harm to historic properties while meeting the identified needs of the project is initiating the Section 106 process early. Early involvement is a time when the range of alternatives is greatest. It also allows time to address any identified issues or controversy without jeopardizing the project's timeline. Even projects without adverse effects can take 3 months, and projects with adverse effects can take 18 months. This flow chart, provided by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, summarizes the process. To quickly summarize, the 4 steps in the Section 106 review process are: 1. Initiate the process by determining if Section 106 applies. 2. Identify historic properties by determining the project's area of effect, identifying historic properties, and evaluating historic significance. 3. Assess adverse effects by identifying if the project will have an adverse effect on historic properties. 4. Resolve adverse effects by avoidance, minimization, and/or mitigation of any adverse effects on historic properties. As shown in red under each step, consultation and public involvement are key throughout each step of the process. For particularly large or complex projects, Section 106 provides the option of developing alternative procedures to achieve compliance. A programmatic agreement, negotiated through consultation at the outset of such a project, can outline the particular steps to be taken as a project develops. This allows the project to fulfill requirements for historic property identification, effects assessment, and resolution of adverse effects to achieve Section 106 compliance. Cultural resource is a generic term we use to indicate a building, structure, district, object, or site, including archaeological sites. In essence, a cultural resource is anything man-made, modified, or considered culturally significant by a group. In MoDOT, we generally deal with three types of resources. 1. Archaeological sites. 2. Architectural resources. And 3. Bridges. Although bridges are a type of architectural resource, bridges are a key transportation resource, and so we treat them as a separate group. The term cultural resources also includes historic landscapes, traditional cultural places, and Native American sacred sites. Again, cultural resources are all of these things. Historic properties are those that are eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. After reviewing the information in the RER, MoDOT will provide the LPA with the guidance needed to navigate the next three steps in the Section 106 process: identifying historic properties, assessing effects, and, if needed, resolving adverse effects. A cultural resource survey identifies the cultural resources that may be present within the project area. The cultural resource survey must be completed by a qualified cultural resources consultant. A list of qualified consultants can be found at the Missouri Department of Natural Resources website. The Cultural Resources Survey is submitted to the SHPO for review and comment. MoDOT Cultural Resources staff must review the survey and provide approval prior to submittal to the SHPO. If historic properties are present, the LPA and MoDOT, on behalf of the Federal Highway Administration, make a recommendation regarding the project's effects to those historic properties. If the SHPO concurs with a no adverse effect determination, then the LPA should upload the SHPO response to the RER and the process is complete. If an adverse effect determination is made, then the LPA must coordinate with MoDOT, SHPO, Native American tribes, and other interested parties to avoid, minimize, and mitigate all cultural resources impacts. Any unresolved adverse effects require a CE2. The Area of Potential Effects, or APE, is used to define the area where we consider projects' effects to cultural resources. In general, we consider the maximum project footprint that includes the existing and new right-of-way and temporary and permanent easements to be the archaeological APE. If there are known off-site activities, for example, borrows, staging areas, utility relocations, etc., they can also be incorporated into the APE. For architectural resources in rural areas, the APE is generally 100 feet beyond any new right-of-way. However, if there is a resource in the APE, we will look at all resources on the property regardless of their distance from the project. In urban areas, the APE is generally 50 feet beyond any new right-of-way. We look at this area beyond the new right-of-way to consider how changes to the setting may impact historic resources. Some projects can affect the historic characteristics of a historic property without actually affecting the property itself. Introducing a new road corridor through an area that will not only affect those resources directly impacted, but also those resources adjacent to the new corridor that could have changes in view, access, noise, and pollution that would harm the features that make the resource eligible for listing on the National Register. A Phase 1 archaeological survey requires a map indicating the maximum footprint of the project, ROW and easements, and landowner permission to access his or her property within this maximum footprint. Phase 1 surveys are conducted to determine if archaeological sites are present within the APE and to initially evaluate them for National Register eligibility. Phase 1 investigations require a review of previous investigations in the project vicinity prior to fieldwork. Fieldwork typically consists of systematic inspection of the APE in search of historic or prehistoric artifacts. A pedestrian survey is one inspection method that consists of searching ground surface when ground visibility is good, for example, in agricultural fields. Another method, if you can't see the ground surface, for example, wooded or grassy areas, is the excavation of shovel probes and screening of soil from the probes. If archaeological sites are found, closer inspection of the site is required to determine its extent and to provide a larger sample of artifacts from the site. If the National Register eligibility of an archaeological site cannot be determined as a result of the Phase 1 investigation, additional sampling of the site may be done as part of a Phase 2 excavation. A Phase 2 investigation can increase review time periods. Although no Phase 2 work would be required if the project can be designed to avoid a site that has been recommended for such an investigation. Phase 2 evaluations typically involve a larger excavation of the site area to provide a larger sample of archaeological deposits and determine their integrity. Good integrity may be represented by artifacts or features found in relatively undisturbed contexts, for example, beneath the plow layer of an agricultural field. Artifacts recovered from both Phase 1 and Phase 2 investigations will need to be cleaned and analyzed by archaeologists. And reports of the investigations need to be published and submitted to MoDOT. The fieldwork for an architectural survey is usually completed before or during the archaeological survey. Architectural resources are photographed and documented. It can be useful to have permission for this survey as well, especially in rural areas where farmsteads might need to be surveyed. After the field survey is done, research in the history of the property, including property ownership, agricultural production for farms, and types of businesses for commercial properties will be done. This information will help determine if a property is significant. An architectural survey typically requires approximately 2 to 3 months to complete after land access is granted to complete the fieldwork and write-up. Bridges are also photographed during the archaeological and architectural surveys. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has issued a program comment for Common Post 1945 concrete and steel bridges, which, due to their commonness, do not require individual review under Section 106. Older or less common bridges require evaluation. Although out of date, Missouri has a statewide bridge survey that provides a starting point for identifying significant bridges. MoDOT will help the LPA with assessment of bridges and provide our eligibility recommendation for the LPA to submit to SHPO. If there aren't any historic properties in the project area, the results of the investigations are documented and sent to SHPO for comment. If there are historic properties in the project area, we must consider the effects of our project on those historic properties. A few examples of common adverse effects for transportation projects include 1. Destruction of the cultural resource. 2. Alterations that are inconsistent with the building's or structure's period of significance. For example, replacing a concrete guardrail on a historic bridge with a modern guardrail would be an alteration. 3. Significant change in setting. For example, construction of a new alignment through a rural historic property, or removing trees or other landscape elements that contribute to the significance of a house would be a change in setting. If it's determined that the project as designed will have an adverse effect on a historic property, we have to look for ways to resolve the adverse effect. We can do this by trying to redesign the project to avoid the historic property or minimize the effect of the project on the historic property. Minimization can be done through project alterations like adding a retaining wall to protect buildings. If we cannot avoid or minimize the adverse effects on the historic property, we have to mitigate. Consultation is key for developing appropriate mitigation measures. A Memorandum of Agreement, or MOA, will be developed specifying the measures that we will use to document the historic property. The MOA is a legally binding document signed by the LPA, the SHPO, and the Federal Highway Administration. MoDOT signs the MOA only if we had a role to play in the mitigation. For very controversial projects, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation may be involved in consultation and may also sign the MOA. From the time a property is acquired, the cultural resource process usually takes 6 to 9 months to conduct mitigation fieldwork, prepare documentation, and get SHPO to review and approve the photo documentation before the building or bridge can be demolished. A timeline for completion is often included in the MOA. When documenting architecture, it is important that the property is purchased intact. The former owner must understand that he or she cannot conduct architectural salvage on the property. If the owner wants to conduct salvage, then the building must be documented before the architectural elements are removed. Most historic bridges on these LPA projects should be marketed for a minimum of 6 months, with an end date at least 6 months prior to the letting. The marketing should start 12 months prior to letting. For major bridges and nationally significant historic bridges, the advertisement should start at least 18 months prior to letting. Section 4F of the Department of Transportation Act of 1966 is a separate regulation that requires Federal Highway Administration, or FHWA, to avoid the use of historic properties unless it can be demonstrated that no feasible and prudent alternatives are available to achieve the purpose and need of the project. Projects that result in a finding of adverse effects under Section 106 and which require a Section 4F use of a historic property require a programmatic evaluation for historic bridges or individual evaluation to show that appropriate alternatives were considered and document the decision-making process. The need for a Section 4F evaluation can significantly impact project timelines. Close coordination with MoDOT on Section 4F issues will help get a project through the process, and MoDOT is a resource for information and guidance. Section 4F resources, commonly called historic properties, are National Register of Historic Places listed or eligible properties, whether publicly or privately owned. It is possible to use a portion of a historic property and not directly impact any buildings. Contributing elements such as landscape features, farm fields, and small-scale elements, including contributing sidewalk and street features, are also protected by Section 4F. Archaeological sites are generally not considered Section 4F resources unless they are significant for preservation in place. Sacred places and burials are also treated as Section 4F resources in Missouri. Section 4F uses de minimis, which results in no adverse effects on a historic property, and a Section 4F use which requires an evaluation to demonstrate there are no prudent and feasible alternatives. Section 4F requires avoidance of historic properties unless there are no feasible and prudent alternatives. If avoidance is not possible, it must be demonstrated through a Section 4F evaluation. Individual Section 4F evaluation will be needed for all cultural Section 4F resources, except bridges. Alternatives will need to be developed to demonstrate that the use of 4F resources is required. These are the minimum alternatives required. The alternatives should include estimates for right-of-way and construction costs. They should also document displacements, business and commercial, and other environmental impacts. Historic bridges can use the nationwide programmatic Section 4F evaluation for historic bridges. MoDOT has a form for these evaluations to simplify the preparation and ensure the required information is provided. It helps Federal Highway Administration review and approve them quickly. An individual Section 4F evaluation will trigger a NEPA CE2 or higher NEPA classification. An individual Section 4F evaluation will generally take 15 to 18 months for preparing the alternatives, writing the draft evaluation, MoDOT review and revisions, and Federal Highway Administration review. Department of the Interior gets a 45-day agency review that is done concurrent with the SHPO review, and there should also be a concurrent public comment period of the draft Section 4F evaluation. Once that is done, the final Section 4F can be prepared, a formal legal sufficiency review is done by the Federal Highway Administration, and then the Federal Highway Administration can approve the use of the Section 4F.